Okay, today we have Jennifer Choyce, my niece and Freya's cousin, and she's a marine biologist, a diver, and an environmentalist.
We've got another guest this week who I've known since I was born, which is really nice. It was really lovely for me watching it, actually, because I watch all of them, but I haven't, I realised, talked to Jennifer in depth. I don't think maybe ever about what she does. We've talked about plenty of other things, but I've never heard her talk about her work in conservation, and I found it really interesting, and she knows her stuff. And yeah, I was just really excited. It made me make lots of notes to talk to her about these things in the future. But yeah, it was really lovely to listen to everything that she's been up to.
If we revisit this, and I hope we will, you should join in.
Yeah, that would be really nice.
Yeah.
That would be nice. It was funny because I think, like, even when we were little, Jennifer was one of those really lucky people who I think always knew exactly what she wanted to do. And both of us were always obsessed with animals and nature, but I was more on the kind of land-based insects and dinosaurs and horses. And Jennifer was more of the dolphins and and turtles and things. And I remember she had this big collection of these sort of beautiful little glass sea creatures, and it was just, she always knew that that was where she was supposed to be. I think she mentioned in the talk that really she should have been a mermaid, and I think that was evident early on.
She did, yes. Well, now she's a fully, well, she's been doing this professionally for quite a while now, 10 or 12 years, hasn't she? So she's, yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
she also has an Instagram address where she has an incredible number of really amazing um, natural history photographs. She's a
Yeah.
fantastic photographer.
Yeah, so you'll hear her talk about what she's been up to and, you know, what she's doing in the podcast. But if you want to see her photographs, she's living in Canada now. And so she's sort of absolutely immersed in this incredible landscape and wildlife. So if you want to see her photography, it's JS Choyce Photography, but Choice is Choyce. So JS Choice Photography, and you can have a look at her photographs there, and they're absolutely beautiful.
So, without more ado, Jennifer. So, would you consider yourself a marine biologist or an environmentalist, or both?
Definitely both. My background and training has very much been marine biology, but I have spent the last over 8 years now working more in the environmental sector, especially alongside industry. So I now class myself as both the marine biologist, environmentalist.
Right. And you've got a blog. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I have my podcast, which I started in February this year. I had the idea years and years ago because I'd been working with the London Zoo as part of my master's, and we did a lot of public engagements where they come around, talk to you about the work and the research, and people seem really interested. You know, they like to know what you're doing to kind of protect nature and the world. But at the time, it just didn't feel like there was maybe more than, you know, TV documentaries and a few bits here and there. And there's always been this disconnect between the scientists that write it and then how the public gets it and hears it and understands it.
Right.
And I'm thinking, I really wish I had this way of bringing all this information to the public. But at the time, a podcast is quite a time thing to do. And at the time, I didn't have enough time and energy to do it. And then with COVID and having some downtime off work for a bit, and all these contacts I've accrued over the years in conservation, in environmental, in ecology, I was like, okay, well, you know what, let's do this. And so Let's Talk Conservation was born. And it's turning out to be quite successful, I hope.
Well, it looks like you've done, what, half a dozen?
I've 3 been released at the moment, but yeah, I have been talking to a lot of people. I fit my podcast around my work schedule, where I do 2 weeks away on 2 weeks away and then 2 weeks back at home, and so I try to catalog as many people as I can, and then I can release them while I'm at work, because I don't have the time while I'm away at work to actually talk to people.
And work is on the north coast of Canada, right?
Yeah, so I work in northern BC. I myself am based out near Vancouver with an environmental consulting company, and my current site is up in the far north regions on the coast, which is epically beautiful, quite something.
But you're not diving, you said.
No, I'm not. I am working coastally, but I am not scuba diving, which is a shame because the waters up there are just the most pure and pristine, so beautiful. But I do spend a lot of time standing out on small boats on the ocean looking for porpoises and seals and whales while we're doing some work. So which is pretty fun. Like, just spend my day standing out.
I remember you once worked in incredibly murky waters off Portsmouth or somewhere, wasn't it?
Yeah, so I did a stint as some geophysical work, and yeah, they took me out doing some seismic surveys, and then I've done diving and taught as a dive master in the UK. And there was one day I think I took a group out in the English Channel, and yeah, it's the visibility is a bit hit and miss.
But that's not necessarily pollution, is it? It's a lot of it's to do with short coastline and things like that.
Yeah, short coastline, dredging in open channels to keep them deep enough for ships just destabilizes the sort of surface sediment a bit, so it tends to kick up a bit more of the sedimentation. Plus, with those sorts of areas, because you have a lot of port traffic coming in and out, you don't get a lot of the base structures that maybe would absorb or stabilize the sediment to the soil. So it's just open. It's like looking at a desert underwater.
Right. No kelp or stuff like that.
Not through certain sections. Once you start getting closer to Cornwall, it opens up a bit, but through kind of the Southampton Channel, it's just very, very, very sandy. There is the occasional World War wreck, which is kind of cool to see, but otherwise, it's a lot of a barren wasteland and a few fish.
But those wrecks must make homes for all kinds of marine creatures, mustn't they?
Yeah, you do get some good colonies of sort of mussels, barnacles. The fish do enjoy hanging around with them. There was one that we found off of Littlehampton that had cuttlefish. You could see eggs of little cuttlefish and stuff on them, which was really quite amazing because it's not something I'd expected to see. That was quite a find.
Right. So, but you also dived in tropical waters as well.
Yeah, so I've always wanted to dive. I've always wanted to be a mermaid, and diving is the closest I will ever get. I spent 8 months working with Global Vision International in the Seychelles when I left school. So sadly, a very long time ago. But that was incredible, looking at the regeneration of coral, looking into sea turtle nesting beaches, and monitoring the whale sharks that were coming through as well around the area. Size, rough ages, what the sex was, how many we could see. That was pretty cool. And then obviously further down in life, I went and worked out on dive boats in Australia for a few months as well.
So how is the regeneration of coral going? Was there any sign of hope?
Yeah, there was actually. So when I was in the Seychelles, it was maybe a year or two after some pretty big bleaching events and some tropical storms that decimated most of the area. But even when we were there, you could still see sort of small sort of colonies of the hardier corals coming back, like the aquaporas and everything. They're small. They do take quite a few years to grow, but they were already coming back. The fish species were already coming back, and that's a really good sign. Other invertebrate species moving back into the area. I unfortunately have not been back to the Seychelles since, but it does look from pictures I've seen of the project continuing that it does look like it's come back nicely. And they just take time. Corals can be sensitive, but they can be harder than we think, and they'll get there.
We always think of coral as in Coral Sea, somewhere warm, but coral grows in the north as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, actually, and even around in the UK, you get some really stunning deep sea coral gardens that are just, they can be huge. They can be absolutely massive branches. They are incredible. A lot of deep sea trenches are found, sort of hard corals and soft corals, mostly a lot of soft corals. But you do get big coral gardens in deep sea trenches, in colder waters. They will grow, nature will always find a way to adapt and evolve. And it is incredible the structures that you can find in the most unlikely places.
Right. And well, unlikely, they must be, I mean, if you're talking about a trench, it must be pretty dark.
Oh, complete darkness. Yeah, it's the proper abyssal territories down there, which is why it's interesting when you do find like the soft corals and the structure lines down there, because generally, you know, you think coral, you think needs bright sunshine to photosynthesize, which they do, but then they just adapt to using what's in the water around them, which can be sort of more sulfury, a bit more hydrogen, and they just adapt to work with the corals, with the creatures around them, with the phytoplankton, and this whole new system, these whole new species evolve around this entirely different world we didn't know existed for a long time.
You told me that your current work on the coast of Canada is basically monitoring the effects of human development on the ocean and the coast.
Yeah, so it's similar to what I had at the job I had in the UK. Is I'm working out with an environmental consultancy, and that just means that we, the environmental protectors, I suppose. Development is always going to happen. There will always be progress. There will always be a need to build industry in the mountains, the forests along the coast. We're then the ones that come in and we put in for like the permits and the provincial and federal restrictions of what you kind of can and cannot do
Right.
with regards to interacting with the marine environment on a sort of development level. So I'm up there making sure that the people that we work with are following these these guidelines and these restrictions. So it's you do tend to get a bit of backlash from especially our locals within the area and from other people who think you're kind of working for the devil and selling your soul because you're working for industry, and it's not. I love my planet, but you can't stop development. It'll always happen. Industry will always happen in whatever form, even if it's for green energy. I've worked on wind farms, worked with wind farms as well. But anything that you do, anything that we get involved in as humans has an impact. And I kind of feel that I'm helping from the inside. You know, it's
I guess the issue is when we do something, whatever it is, even if it's something good, there is a negative impact, but there has to be a recovery process. And you talked not just about the coral recovering, but you talked about landscape and the biosphere reinstating itself.
yeah. So with a lot of these projects, big or small, whether it's big industrial or small residential developments, generally with around the world, actually, it's not just in Canada, they do it in the UK and other countries, you have to have like an offsetting area. So whatever biodiversity you are impacting for your, say, the development sites, you then within the scope of that area need to have a biodiversity offsetting area where you are giving back. You're helping to rebuild like native species or rebuild an ecosystem that benefits the area to help the damage that you've done, essentially. So where we are, we have the main site, and then we have a nice area kind of on the coast and around the corner from where our site is as an offsetting development site.
Theoretically, probably half of everything we've built, half of our cities, our transport systems, could all be completely covered by nature. Effectively, they could be underground. We don't need to have a cinema or I don't know, even a shopping mall doesn't need to be in the sunlight.
No, but then if you start tunneling everything underground, then that becomes, you have different complications. That because obviously, you know,
No,
you've
I'm not
got.
thinking of tunneling. I'm thinking of covering them over.
I mean, yeah, you could do, and there are cities out there now, like green buildings are becoming a very big thing. Examples going in my head, I think it might even be in areas like Singapore where they have like literal forests on the side of their skyscrapers trying to bring everything back. Green buildings and green roofs are becoming a bit more of a thing around towns as well. In Vancouver here, we have on our the waterfront downtown, they have the convention centre. That's got a nice big green roof, which is just beautiful. And it gets really colourful in the springtime. And there are a lot of places now where building small like microforests within an urban area to kind of bring back natural diversity and species back again. I've already said the green roofs, but like there are, and biodiversity highways as well. So you get green spaces, either like the wildlife bridges that are very popular in America, and we're slowly bringing them to the UK. But then you also get areas within highways where you can kind of try and protect like a section of diversity, try and keep like a natural meadow for species. So it's we are getting better. I say over the last sort of 15-20 years, we are getting better at reincorporating nature with our designs for life.
No, I applaud the green buildings and the sort of essentially extravagant flower pots. But the bottom line is they are beautifying basically ugly buildings. And what we should be doing is something a great deal more effective in terms of introducing a great deal more of nature into our living spaces.
I think we're still a few years away from that level of importance, though. It's still very much getting the buildings in, establishing what we need before we focus on what maybe nature needs to kind of come back and progress again.
Wouldn't you say they're the same thing? What we need is what nature needs. It's the same.
I think so, because there's a lot of species out there, like, you know, I mean, literally the birds and the bees who kind of, you know, they pollinate the fields, they help us with our food, keep down other pests and bugs. And yeah, I mean, we need nature. We need nature way more than we realize that we do. I think they should be sort of simultaneous together, but not everyone thinks the same way as a lot of us.
There are too many of us for sure, but nevertheless, we could be living in a way that makes
playing from Roger Dean's MacBook Pro
a much smaller impact on the planet. And I think we're going to be very dependent on people like you who know what they're doing with the environment, that can bring about that healing that we do to the damage we do when we build all the things we used to need but need less of now, like giant coal-based industries and things. You know, that they can grow over, they can get covered in grass and trees and things. Even Chernobyl looks like a few buildings scattered in a forest now. But that's because the humans have left. We need to be able to do that when the humans are still there.
No, this is true. And it doesn't take very long for nature to come back. It's one thing with doing the environmental work. When I was living back in the UK, we'd go to these sites of, like, say, old military sites, for example, that have been shut down or not used, and you go in there and there's just trees growing out of houses and like nature has come back in a really strong way. But there's a lot of people out there that have this thought, that are going there. And actually, that's one thing with my podcast, is the people I've tried to talk to and to target is these companies, these people, these individuals who are trying to get the message out that we need to work better with nature. We need to have different ways to protect nature, to move us forward with nature, because that's how we save the planet, essentially. But it is becoming more and more of an opinion, and with each new generation it's a stronger and stronger opinion, and it will get there. There will be this tipping point where suddenly being green, being sustainable with the environment is like kind of where we go. Right. And I don't think we're too far off that tipping point at the moment where it'll all switch.
But we should be doing it now. I read an interesting thing about some wind farms built where fish breed. And the complaints from the fishermen were that they couldn't catch the fish there. But from nature's point of view, that sounds like a good thing. So the wind farms are actually protecting the fish. But what's the balance there? Are they on balance neutral or harmful or helpful?
Ooh.
Can't get out of
Yeah. I'm not completely opposed to wind farms, especially whether when they're offshore, because they, and I know that the ones we have off the UK have started being self-sufficient. They've paid themselves off and they're sustainable, and it's a good clean energy that we need. Obviously, dropping giant pylons on the ocean floor and digging into the ground is not supremely ideal, but once you're in, they're in. Obviously, the plus side to it is that they then are no fishing areas, because you can't exactly take a giant trawler through a field of wind turbines, and so they've kind of become these natural protections for fish. So it's not, again, it's not such a bad thing. Fishing's always one of those tricky ones, because it's been a sustainable way of life for as long as humans have been around. But obviously the fish stocks aren't quite where they are. So any areas where people can't go and find fish become an area of like confrontation, because they want to be able to get the fish, because they're having to fish longer, fish harder, and fish for more, because the stocks aren't quite where they were. So as soon as you say, oh, you can't go in here, it might be a fish breeding ground, but now it's a wind farm, you have to stay out, you have to catch whatever comes around the edge. It's always going to be a bit more controversial.
It looks like it would be a good idea to build yet more of them. I mean, if we were a desert country, we could build huge solar farms in the desert, but we have to make use of what resources we have, which is largely the wind.
If only could you rain powered for the UK as well. But yeah, I quite like the idea of either wind farms or trying to move tidal, especially for island-based communities. Like if you can prove they're not going to be too, if the data there is there for tidal power, that it's not going to be too just like disturbing to estuarine and river systems that are dependent in those areas. If you're in an island community, you're going to have access to a lot of tidal. And especially around like the UK, you know, wind is a thing, and so bigger wind farms, or maybe smaller wind farms just kind of dotted around, would not be the worst thing in the world. But again, they are expensive. There's a lot involved with setting them up, and it takes them a few years, many years, to kind of be worth the value. But with there are a lot of them off site right now that have expanded through phase 1s, phase 2s, and phase 3s, where they're massive, and they are sustaining us. We do have the energy now to put into the country. They've essentially paid off what they cost to make, and that's great. And so maybe that's the way we should be going.
Has anyone looked at the consequences in the sea around them? There used to be worries about birds flying into them, but I don't know if that's true. Do they actually do that?
There is a lot of environmental work that goes into building up a wind farm. Obviously, there's all the geophysics of like looking at the seafloor, making sure you're not going to hit any pockets of gas, any pockets of peat, because obviously you're still looking at history under the sediment as well that you don't want to damage. Then you have to look at migration paths for cetaceans, seals, and everything as well that go around there, because obviously when you're putting them in, there's a lot of pile driving noise, which is very disruptive. And so birds then also play into that, because you don't want to be blocking off migration paths, because there have been reports, there have been stories, they can fly into them. It's not that they can't see them, it's just maybe they've just timed it wrong. But it doesn't also mean the birds wouldn't adapt to kind of go around them if they're there long enough. But I think there's looks into like deterrence to try and maybe kind of keep the birds further away, further around. Like they have deterrents underwater to kind of keep cetaceans and seals and stuff away when they're doing the work. But yeah, it is a factor. It is something people do have to look into, and placement is dependent on a multitude of factors.
Is this job of yours fixed to the development, or is it a permanent job?
No, it's a permanent job. I'm permanently employed by my company. It's just this is the project that I've been put on at the moment, but there's a lot of other work going on.
Okay, so you're going to get a good picture of A, what damage we do, and B, how it can be fixed.
Yeah, so with a lot of large scale project, there's always monitoring after it. So we don't ever just do the project, and then walk away and never look back.
Right.
You tend to build in a yearly monitoring program, 3-year monitoring program, a 5-year monitoring program, and then sometimes even for big things, maybe a 10-year monitoring program, because you want to see that what you have recommended, what you have done, all these offsetting measures that you're trying to do to help the environment once you're no longer there are actually working. Because there's no point otherwise. There's no point saying you have to do all this and then you never go and see it again, because you don't know if they've done it, and then B, you don't know if it works. But then if they do it and it does work, then you've got the data to say, okay, well, in this project, similar to what we're doing now, this worked, so let's try this here. And it's that evidence that you need to build up that helps to build policy, legislations, all this stuff that actually makes industry and the environment a bit more compatible.
I was looking at a project, actually weirdly off the coast of Turkey once, and it was a marina project. And the information we were given was about breakwaters and things like that. And the ones that they favored were ones that looked like sort of weird building blocks that interlocked, but didn't. So they created a lot of spaces that became homes for marine creatures. Particularly, they were very keen that octopi would live there.
I like to think of them as looking like the old jacks you used to play with as a kid, with the ball and the little kind of spikes. And they're very popular goods. They're a popular design, and they also, because of being able to sort of interlock but with space, they still allow a good processes of water to flow through, so you get nutrients coming through and everything as well.
Right. Do they put that kind of structure in on purpose, or is it just wherever there's a development, hopefully that's what will be a consequence?
I honestly am not 100% sure. I have seen quite a few developments that use those. Sorry, try that one again. I do see a few developments that have used those, and they are around the area. We actually, around the coast of Vancouver, I know there's a few spots where they have them. They also act as a good natural wave break in areas that don't have a lot of cover from, like, say, really high tides or like those sort of freak swells that come through. So they're a good coastal defense as well as a fun block for biodiversity to rebuild around.
Unfortunately, of course, they're concrete, and concrete made out of calcium carbonate. And when you bake it to make cement, you release a lot of carbon dioxide. But nevertheless, hopefully, manufacturers of cement will learn how to deal with that.
I feel like there's, and again, I'm not an expert, but there needs to, I think there's an extra process if it has to go into the marine environment, because you can't have all that breaking down in the system over salt water. But again, I'm not 100% sure.
But it seems to me, if we're going to deal with a lot of global warming, even if we can solve the problem of global warming, which undoubtedly we could if we've got the will for it, in the meantime, seawater is going to rise, even if we fix it and get it eventually back to what we think of as normal. There is going to be a meantime where the water is going to rise. So coastal defenses are going to be a worldwide issue, aren't they?
Yes, yeah, and there are some measures in place that were put in place years and years ago, like the Thames Barrier, for example, was always set up in case of like massive sea level rise. But I think levels have kind of built up gradually enough now, and I again, not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure there was something out there that now the Thames Barrier, if there was this massive sort of sudden dramatic increase in sea level rise overnight, like if all the ice caps melted overnight, the Thames Barrier actually it's been shifted or the levels are currently at a point where it actually would be ineffective. And this is the thing, there's a lot of people who kind of put measures out there, but it's hard to gauge sea level rise and what's really going to trigger it and cause it and how quickly it may happen. There are studies that show that the levels are globally rising, but it's obviously over time and not in a way that you can walk outside your front door and be like, one day it's here and the next day you come out and it's 6 foot higher. It's not on that kind of a scale. It'll be quantitatively over time, because nothing's melting it that quickly. but it will be a concern. And there's going to be a lot of low-lying areas of all countries, island communities, that if we do get this massive surge and these huge rises in sea levels, that could just disappear.
Yeah, as we were saying earlier, including places like Florida and Louisiana and Holland, for that matter.
Yeah.
North.
But I mean, even a lot of the UK, and to be honest, probably a fair amount of parts of like past Vancouver, like down there's a whole area called Delta for a reason. I mean, that's pretty low lying. If anything rises too high, that could be in problems.
Yeah. The world is going to be a much more crowded place, isn't it?
Everyone will be running up mountainsides.
Yeah. Jennifer, I'm going to say thank you very much for doing this, but let me ask you just before we end, tell me about the people you've interviewed on your podcast.
Yeah, so first, I'll start with the 3 that are already out there in the world, which, by the way, with the podcast, you can get it on Apple and Spotify, Amazon Music, and a bunch of other platforms. We had Christina Zanato, who is based out in the Bahamas, and she does incredible work for shark conservation as well as ecosystem conservation for caves out there. I mean, she is just breaking barriers. She is a cave diving queen. She's incredible. So it was really interesting to talk to her about how the cave systems link to like the mangroves in the open ocean, how everything is just, one big whole. You can't just take on this kind of conservation as like the one animal or the one area. You need to think of them all as a big connected system.
Yeah.
There was Kimberly Ray from the Marine Conservation Network, where she is basically a platform for smaller kind of conservation companies for oceans around the world to connect and get their message spread further. And they have some incredible programs working with kids to really encourage the next generation of ocean crusaders, which is cool. And the most recent one was with Dr. Andy Lewis, who is the founder of the Coral Sea Foundation. And he does a lot of amazing work in the Northern Coral Sea through Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands and Melanesia, working with the tribal communities on those islands and how to sustainably work with the corals so that they can kind of keep producing fish and support their growing populations for the next generations to come. And they do an amazing program with the women in these communities, teaching them to dive, teaching them about coral conservation, and then they go back and teach their communities. So that's pretty cool. I have a whole range of guests coming further than that, kind of spreading, but it's very much focused on conservation actions around the world from smaller foundations, individuals, and maybe moving into like larger foundations.
If we have to eat fish, it seems it's better not to take them out of the ocean. It doesn't sound very nice to talk about fish farming, but there are much better ways of doing it than we are doing it. And it does seem to me much better for the planet not to be fishing. There is almost no fish that aren't threatened.
And this is true. And I don't think it's more the stop fishing. It's more finding a balance and ways to manage how we do it, because it's not just from us, like talking about the Americas and the UK and Europe. Yeah, we fish a lot, but then you have to remember there's all these smaller communities where fishing is all they have. That is the only way they can feed their families, get money, and make that. And they are learning how to work with the ocean and their environments to keep their stocks up to scratch. We kind of almost need to learn from that. The damage to the larger fish stocks has already been done when you started fishing. And there's always been stories of how people used to catch like 3-4 meter cod, and now they're catching like 60 centimeter cod. It's quite a change. But when you have these no take zones, like off of the Grand Banks in Canada, their stocks came back pretty quickly in the scheme of things, and are now looking healthier. And in the UK, when they put restrictions on cod, the cod stocks are starting to come back a bit stronger. You are getting larger individuals. So it proves that it can be done. We just need to be open to change and managing how we fish, because they will come back. It's just finding that balance between how much we need and how much is there and where we need to get it to. But then it's not just where we need to get it to have healthy stocks, it's where we need to get them to have a healthy stock that can be fished and stay healthy.
Yes.
I'm also an advocate. I'm terrible as a marine biologist, but I do love my sushi. Sorry.
Jennifer, I'm going to call you again, but thank you very much.
No, thank you, Roger. It's been really fun to have a bit more of a discussion about this with you.
No, it's been great. Thank you. And
Okay.
I look forward to doing it again.
Yes, definitely. Well, I'll get you onto my show. We can have further conversations.
There you go. All right. Thank you.
All right.
I'm going to stop recording now.